Hey, this is Julian Sanchez with your WatchCats news roundup for Monday, April 14th, 2025. First up, via Politico, federal judge Jeanette A. Vargas, in a written opinion on Friday, has rolled back an order she had put into effect a couple months prior, barring DOGE workers from accessing sensitive Treasury Department databases. She's now authorized one DOGE staffer, Ryan Wonderly, to access those payment and data systems, provided he completes the usual training that Treasury Department employees are supposed to go through and submits a financial disclosure report. So that is the first foot in the door. It may be that ultimately one person with that access is all they require to accomplish the kind of changes that they intend to make. So it's worth keeping a close eye on that. I think a lot of commenters have seen access to those Treasury payment systems as pretty critical to enabling a much more centralized and flexible control over the entire federal bureaucracy. If you kind of control how the money flows, and you can do that with a kind of one-click setup, you have, in effect, radically centralized the bureaucracy. Via the Wall Street Journal, an analysis finds that DOGE notwithstanding, federal spending since the inauguration is actually higher than where it was for the same 3-month period during the Biden administration's final year in office. This is even as Donald Trump pledges a jaw-dropping and record-breaking $1 trillion budget for defense in the future. I think this is maybe a symptom that while the marketing around DOGE has been around cutting federal spending, that is not necessarily the primary goal. This is an administration that does not actually seem super concerned in with things like deficit reduction. Rather, that is a kind of marketable label to put on what is effectively an effort to really change the composition of the federal workforce, change it into a kind of patronage system, and to essentially reorient spending priorities around what Trump's preferences align with rather than what Congress has appropriated. And of course, to sort of seize control of the IT infrastructure that the federal government runs on. Apropos of the question of how much DOGE is saving, I think it's we're looking at we have actually a whole stack of articles from the New York Times that are worth talking about, but most relative to the question of savings. There's a piece there with headlined, DOGE is far short of its goal and still overstating its progress. So as we discussed in previous roundups, the initial goals DOGE laid out were to cut $2 trillion from the federal budget per year, and then that was downgraded to $1 trillion. No one thought that was realistic. That has again been downgraded to $150 billion, which is what their website currently claims they're saving. But despite having corrected a lot of errors that were previously identified on the Doge.gov wall of receipts, they still are dramatically overestimating the actual amount that they have managed to save. It's hard to say exactly how much they're overstating it because for a little over 60% of the funds they've claimed they've saved, there's no real detail on the site. So it's hard to vet that. But of the savings we do have information about, in a lot of cases, the New York Times found that the biggest claimed savings do not stand up to any kind of scrutiny at all. So one of those claims include a claim of a contract of nearly $2 billion that had actually been canceled previously by the Biden administration. So DOGE did not actually cancel that. It was already canceled. So that's $2 billion in savings they're claiming that were not saved. Another claim involved a grant that was paid out to nonprofits to do work on vaccines in the amount of $1.75 billion. That, too, was a grant that had already been paid out in full. So canceling it after the money has been paid out does not save any money. It's another $1.75 billion in not real savings. Another massive item there is a facility that was being used to house unaccompanied migrant children entering the United States. The thing is, that facility had effectively already been empty for a year. It was not being used because of a decline in the need to deal with unaccompanied migrant children. And so the government was paying essentially to hold that on standby in case it were needed again. So the sort of total amount of savings from canceling that contract were really about $29 million. DOGE is claiming $2.9 billion because they were estimating the savings as though the place were operating at full capacity. So another almost $3 billion in claimed savings that just does not exist. In another case, they took credit for canceling a human resources contract in the sum of $318 million. That had never been awarded. This was a contract apparently that had been posted as a kind of request for proposals, but it's not clear that how many bids had come in, whether they were anywhere near assigning the contract, let alone what kind of dollar amount would have been attached to that contract. So I think the pattern we're seeing again and again for the minority of claimed savings that is actually independently checkable is the numbers do not add up. They are, in many cases, claiming multiple billions of dollars in savings when the real amount is zero. And in a lot of other cases where the amount is a whole lot lower. Again, in part because, as we've discussed in previous roundups, what they're often seems doing is saying, if there's a contract with an upper limit, right, that might potentially spend as much as $300 million over the course of 5 years, they count in a single year the maximum possible value of that contract as the amount they've saved, even though the real amount being laid out in any given year is a tiny fraction of that. Incidentally, the New York Times also has a kind of useful little interactive feature called Why Elon Musk Hasn't Come Close to Finding $1 trillion in Cuts that looks at the composition of the federal budget. And the short of it is that non-defense discretionary spending, which is where DOGE has been to date focusing its energy, is basically a pretty small fraction of the federal budget. You could cut that to zero and not really get anywhere near hitting the goals for savings that they've laid out for themselves. Rather, the big money in the budget is in defense and healthcare spending and entitlements like Social Security. If you really wanted to save serious money, that's where you would have to turn your attention, and that would probably require congressional action, not just executive reshuffling. New York Times also reports that the federal workforce is steeling itself for another round of layoffs. Monday is the deadline for agencies to provide a plan to make yet deeper cuts in their workforce. And of course, with that on the horizon, a lot of employees are opting to leave on their own by taking one of a variety of deferred resignation offers where they effectively get paid for some amount of time while not actually having to show up at the office, and then their employment is terminated down the line in a few months. A couple more from the New York Times. DOGE has made some pretty drastic cuts to the Astrogeology Science Center in Flagstaff, Arizona. This is an agency that provides help to this nominally at the Department of the Interior, but mostly funded by NASA, and kind of ironically has frequently provided help to Elon Musk's own SpaceX. They provide information that is, aids with landing either manned or unmanned craft on extraterrestrial surfaces like the moon or Mars. So that is apparently getting a cut of at least 20%. Most of the folks on staff there say, it's not like this is a sprawling bureaucracy. That level of cut would leave it more or less non-functional. Finally, I think I mentioned the other day in a roundup, dubious claims being made about voter fraud based on analysis of Social Security databases. Since then, Elon Musk has also been vocally talking about supposed unemployment fraud and claiming that there are 5-year-olds and people who aren't even born yet and people who are 150 collecting unemployment. Emily Badger, who we speak to in our next WatchCats podcast proper coming up this week, did a look at that and actually found the story is more interesting than that. It's sort of complicated, so I don't know how well I can summarize it quickly here, but take a look. In short, it seems like what they're looking at is it's actually dummy accounts that remain in federal databases because after pandemic aid was provided, this is during the first Trump administration, a lot of fraudulent claims were made. And so the way apparently states at the urging of the federal government dealt with a lot of those claims was to assign them to dummy accounts that were sort of obviously not real people making real claims in order to essentially keep track of those in the system without having them potentially attached to the names of real people who might later be, falsely associated with those fraudulent claims. It's a weird and complicated story, but it's worth taking a look at. And it's another sort of instance of DOGE people running in, not really understanding the data they're looking at, not bothering to ask people who have been there for a while, who have expertise, and rushing to Twitter/X or other social media with breathless claims about having untangled this obvious fraud that the idiots who have been working there for 10 years were too stupid to spot. Seems to be something of a pattern. Wired has a follow-up on a story we mentioned in a previous roundup, a hackathon at the IRS to design a kind of master API or application program interface for concentrating and consolidating access to various IRS data sets. One of the takeaways from the sources that spoke to Wired is that it seems that the goal there is to use the Foundry platform designed by Palantir, which is a contractor mostly known for surveillance, intelligence, and defense-related contracts, as a kind of one-stop read center for all IRS data that would enable AI-based queries against that data set. Another story worth keeping an eye on to see what those changes foretell. They are apparently on schedule to, or they claim to be on schedule to finish a kind of overhaul of the IRS's IT systems within 30 days, which is a significantly accelerated schedule. One might, say frankly, a ridiculously accelerated schedule for an overhaul of an IT system of that size and complexity. Via the Washington Post, DOGE has apparently taken control of grants.gov, the federal grants website to which grant opportunities are posted and which accepts applications. In the past, various different agencies had their own access to that site to post new grant availabilities and to accept applications. Apparently, DOGE engineers, apparently without giving anyone any kind of notice, shut off external access to that site. So DOGE is now effectively acting as a kind of choke point over the main sort of electronic clearinghouse for federal grant announcements. So people are worried that could significantly delay the system if now, before you can post a grant that may have been appropriated and you've got funding aside and you're trying to take in applications in order to award the grant in time. But now apparently that has to go through a kind of filter process where DOGE will decide whether that grant is aligned with the administration's priorities. Also on the chopping block, and also from the Washington Post, memo obtained by the Washington Post says that the State Department is looking at cuts of as much as 48%, nearly half, in a future budget, something that, again, a lot of experts worry would seriously undermine American diplomacy, American soft power, and international influence. Of course, a big part of that, including the dismantling of the USAID, which we have discussed in previous roundups. Maybe most sort of weird and interesting is a Washington Post story about how a lot of DOGE staffers are now holding senior jobs in multiple federal agencies, some of them effectively having job titles in as many as 7 different agencies. This is, to put it mildly, wildly unorthodox. It's not really something we've ever seen before. You would occasionally have, situations where someone is detailed from one agency to one other agency, but usually their access at the home agency is shut off while they're being seconded to the second agency. And this is, concerning for a lot of reasons. For one, it is a way of circumventing the kind of siloing that has previously been a kind of hallmark of how the government operates. Normally, you do not have, one person with privileged access at 7 or 8 different government agencies simultaneously, precisely because that is an enhanced security risk. You compromise one person's access, and now you have your fingers in a whole lot of different cupcakes. So worth taking a look at that. It seems to essentially be a way to let them exercise power, nominally within the reporting structure or the hierarchy of that agency, even though they're effectively an outside actor. Also, some kind of bigger picture stories worth taking a look at. NPR took a close look at a program that DOGE cut for students with disabilities. The idea is to help high school graduates with learning disabilities to transition into adult life, to the workforce, to move from a situation where they had a lot of structure and support and ensure that that is not completely sort of pulled away as they transition to trying to function in the wider world and in the market economy. A kind of close look there at some of the students affected by the elimination of that program. You do sort of have to wonder whether maybe they just didn't like the word transition. It sounds too much like what transgender folks do. And finally, Politico has a close look at DOGE's immigration task force. This is headed by Antonio Gracias, someone we mentioned in a previous roundup as responsible for spreading some pretty dubious claims about vote fraud based on analysis of Social Security databases and state voting rolls. This is a really interesting piece because I think it highlights, as the article itself says, the extent to which DOGE's brief is not really just about identifying wasteful contracts and trying to cut spending, but rather they're acting as a kind of data hub. They are working to attempt to synthesize data from across many different federal databases so that that information can be used, for example, for immigration enforcement, and by the same token, so that other federal data sets like Social Security databases can become a tool of immigration enforcement, as we discussed again on a previous roundup, trying to essentially deter people from remaining in the country by marking them as dead as far as Social Security is concerned. So another story I think that's going to be worth keeping a close eye on. I think it will become, again, increasingly clear that DOGE is not really just about cutting spending, but is about transforming and centralizing the federal bureaucracy in a way that implements parts of the Trump administration's agenda that are not at all restricted to finding ways to cut waste and limit spending. That is the major news stories for today. I had to run through those a little bit quickly because there are so many at the end of a weekend. But keep your eyes here for our next roundup, and also coming soon this week for our conversation with the New York Times' Emily Badger. Catch you then.